What's a hipster, Taplines listener? As Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart once said, you kind of know it when you see it, and around the turn of the 21st century, it was a pretty good bet you were looking at a hipster if you saw, I don't know, American Spirit cigarettes, handlebar mustaches, ironic knuckle tattoos, double-decker bikes. I mean, the list of aesthetic signifiers goes on and on, honestly. As Dick Cantwell, the co-founder of Elysian Brewing Company, described to us in a recent Taplines episode, by midway through the 2010s, craft beer itself had become a harbinger of hipsterism, to its detriment. By then, the term had all but lost its meaning. By now, when we're recording this in 2023, it most certainly has. But in the early aughts, the hipster was still coming into his own in soon-to-be hotbeds of cultural reproduction and breakneck gentrification like Brooklyn, New York, Austin, Texas, and Portland, Oregon. And he, or she, or they, this phenomenon transcended gender, wasn't drinking craft beer. He was drinking Pabst Blue Ribbon. How and why that came to be is the subject of hundreds of thousands of words written and dozens upon dozens upon dozens of marketing case studies and PowerPoint decks. And we're gonna get into all that and more in just a moment, listener. But what you need to understand is that PBR wasn't always destined to represent an entire American subculture. In fact, as Y2K approached, it seemed destined for the scrap heap, along with its namesake firm. After decamping the historic brewing metropolis of Milwaukee for San Antonio 5 years prior, Pabst Brewing Company was in disarray. Its ownership structure was Byzantine, its portfolio was outdated, and PBR volumes were hitting historic lows. When Neil Stewart joined the company in the year 2000, it was being run by a charitable foundation that was legally obligated to attempt to sell it every 5 years. Nobody was buying Pabst the company, but in one city in the Pacific Northwest, people had mysteriously bucked recent trends and begun buying Pabst the beer, and a lot of it. Neil investigated, and what he saw was the beginning of a trend that would change the trajectory of PBR, of Pabst Brewing Company, of the American brewing industry, hell, of consumer packaged goods marketing in the United States writ large. Diehard Taplines listeners already know what came next thanks to our earlier episode with Steve Sticks Nilsson, who worked on the Blue Ribbon brand in the latter aughts and into the 2010s. But today, we kick off part one of a Taplines two-parter with Neil Stewart himself that'll function sort of like a prequel to that episode. In this episode, we'll go deep into PBR's unlikely, inimitable rise in the early aughts, not just as a value-priced beer, but as the red, white, and blue face of an entire moment in the American zeitgeist. It's Neil Stewart, it's Pabst Blue Ribbon, it's how an emerging subculture found its liquid avatar. And it's all right here, right now, on VinePair's Taplines. Neil Stewart, welcome to Taplines on the VinePair Podcast Network. We are so glad to have you, my friend.
Very good to be here. I'm happy to share some stories of my past career in the beer industry.
Yes, and we will get right into those stories. But before we do, Neil, where are you joining us from today?
I live in Louisville, Kentucky, and I'm currently not working in the beer industry. I work for a company called Dano's Seasoning. So people might know us from our founder, a guy named Dan Oliver, who started a seasoning brand and blew up on TikTok. And now we're a nationwide brand and trying to disrupt the seasoning industry.
Love that, man. Man, if you're a beer marketer and you're blown up on TikTok, that is potentially bad news from a regulatory standpoint. Luckily, no such regulatory hurdles exist for cooking seasoning, so you're in the clear there. You're a little bit different than your former business.
It's I do have to think about compliance with the FDA every once in a while, but comparatively versus the alc bev industry, this is a breeze.
Yeah, slightly less regulated. Right on.
Yeah.
So Neil, we got you on today because we are going to be looking back in history. We're going to scroll the Taplines time machine back about 20 years, maybe 25-ish. We're going to go right to the turn of the century, right? Y2K is in the offing. Who's president? I guess Bush. Bush has just become president on the back of the hanging Chads.
Yep.
And we're going back because we want to talk about a brand that you were intimately involved with during your time in the beer industry. Pabst Blue Ribbon, of course, owned by the Pabst Brewing Corporation. And in 2000 ish, right around this period that we're looking at right now, Pabst Blue Ribbon wasn't doing all so hot. Tell me a little bit about when you first were joining up at Pabst Brewing Company, what you were walking in on.
Yeah, it was doing terrible. I mean, the entire company was in a free fall. We had just entered into a contract brewing agreement with then Miller Brewing Company. We still had two breweries in existence, one in San Antonio, which is where I was based, and then one in Lehigh, Pennsylvania. I'm not even sure who owns that brewery now. Is that Sam Adams that owns that?
Your guess is good. Sam Adams, Boston Beer Company is a good guess. Yeah, that's a good guess. Yeah.
So, anyway, I joined the company in August of 2000. I'm actually from St. Louis originally, and I had worked on the agency side for the big brewery there and got just a little bit of beer experience. And I wanted to leave St. Louis. I moved to Austin, Texas on a whim one day and ended up finding a job in San Antonio, Texas in the beer industry and applied for it and was lucky enough to get it and joined the company as a divisional marketing manager in August of 2000. In terms of the company performance at that time, if the company was declining by single digits, that was worthy of a celebration. The company had been in decline for quite some time.
Oh boy!
It was owned by a charitable trust. Are you familiar with any of that storyline?
Tell us a little bit about it. I've done a little bit of research on this, but I think our listeners would benefit from understanding the dire straits that Pabst Brewing Company was in and the structure by which sort of it was being governed at that time.
Yeah, so it was owned by a charitable trust, and the board of directors was based in Northern California. So the company was previously owned by a guy named Paul Kalmanovitz, who was an immigrant to the United States, and he had made his fortune primarily in real estate, and then at one point bought Pabst Brewing Company, and then at some point in like the mid to late 90s, Pabst bought the Stroh Brewing Company, which was kind of the small fish buying the big fish, but somehow they worked that out. Well, Mr. Kalmanovitz passed away. He had no one to leave the brewery to. The folklore was that actually in his will, he left the brewery to his pets. He and his wife had an assortment of pets, and they literally inherited the company. And so because pets can't own a company, it went into a charitable trust. And that charitable trust, the beneficiary of it was a hospital in Northern California, which had prolonged the life of Paul Kalmanovitz's wife at one point in time. She was diagnosed with some sort of fatal
Chronic
disease.
Illness.
Yeah. And some doctors prolonged her life, and then he was like forever indebted to them. And so all of the profits of the Pabst Brewing Company at that time, and the company was still making money, it just was in decline. But all of the profits of the company were pushed to this charitable trust. And people often asked us, like, why aren't you promoting this? Like, this is amazing. This is like a nonprofit company. Well, it wasn't a nonprofit company. It was a charitable trust. And according to federal law, a charitable trust cannot own a for-profit company of that size. So the company every 5 years had to make, per federal regulations, had to make a reasonable attempt to sell itself. So in 2000, that every 5 years was 2000, 2005, 2010. So they tried to sell it in 2000, didn't happen. I started shortly thereafter. The guy who was CEO was a guy named Bill Bidding, who was the lawyer for Paul Kalmanovitz. And when he failed in being able to sell the company, because they didn't have to take just any old offer, the government would kind of step in and say, all right, that's a fair offer and that's not a fair offer.
Right. Okay.
So he failed in that attempt. He resigned. We were in terrible financial condition because we had, I think literally at that time, we had 2,000 distributors across the country because it was all of these non-consolidated networks.
Right.
There was the Heilemann, the Pabst
Miller, and then
Network.
everybody else. Yeah, right.
Yep, yep. And that was back in the age where, there's not nearly the distributor consolidation that there is today. So we had 2,000 distributors across the country. Many of them were not paying their bills, but we were still shipping them beer for some reason. Yeah. And so when that guy, Bill Bidding, quit, they hired this kind of like crisis emergency company that could come in and manage it. I want to say the name of the company was called Crossroads.
Okay.
And this guy kind of came in and like officed out of San Antonio and like laid the smackdown on all these distributors and said, either you pay us right now or we are suing you. Well, people started to pay, so that was good. So the financials of the company started to kind of get fixed. They were only in that for a while, but then they finally did hire a new CEO, a guy named Brian Kovalchuk, who probably joined the company, I want to say in 2002. And then and this is just what I gathered from working there during this time, but his mission was to sell the company for a fair price.
Sure.
And so he worked through 2005. He lived in Minneapolis, commuted down to San Antonio every week, had this like crazy schedule.
Just a terrible life, by the way. That's just an awful way to live. Yeah.
Yeah. Flying Northwest Airlines from Minneapolis to San Antonio every Sunday night probably wasn't great. So yeah, he was unable to sell the company, and and we had investment bankers helping us. I think we had hired Merrill Lynch at that time.
Sure.
And so when he didn't sell the company, he was like, "All right, I'm out." New CEO came in, a guy named Kevin Kotecki. And by that time, I was like, all right, this is crazy. I'm going to go work for another brewery.
Okay. We've got a lot to unpack here. I don't know.
A lot.
Put more time on the clock. First of all, I want to hear about this corporation run by pets. This sounds like a Matt Damon follow-up to We Bought a Zoo. Like there was a time when, I mean, in a trivial and glib sense, but also, I suppose, in a technical sense, if that were true, and I know that's folklore, we're not sure whether or not that's true. If it were true, people were working for pets. They were working for animals. Like, okay, so that's very, very concerning. And you sort of get this. I mean, this has like a circus element to it, dude. We're like, like the hospital in Northern California. They're the beneficiary. The federal government wants to see that they make an attempt Pabst makes an attempt every 5 years to sell, but no one will buy. So all these leaders come through, they give it their old college try, and then they get the hell out of there. Then the guy from Crossroads, this company that sounds like a rehab facility, is coming in and threatening to sue like Joe Schmo Pabst, distributor who owns like, Mississippi territory or wherever he is. He's like, hey, you got 15 unpaid invoices here. You better start remitting. Man, okay. So you walked into a mess.
Here's an interesting point. I mean, we had all those delinquent distributors who hadn't paid in hundreds of days, but we were in this contract brewing agreement. But our net with Miller Brewing Company on the contract brewing was 10 days.
What?
So best case scenario, they're paying on net 30 and then we're paying on net 10. So just like add up all of the interest 20 days at a time.
Right.
And that's probably millions of dollars a year.
On its own. Anyway, anyone who's had any experience managing cash flow and is listening to this just had a heart attack when you heard them say
I also think it's worth talking about Paul Kalmanovitz's strategy. So before he passed away, which was before I was with the company. But I mean, think about it from his perspective. He was an aging man. By that time, he was a widower, and he knew he was going to die. He knew he had no one to give the brewery to. So he went into like when strategists talk about a milk strategy, this was a milk strategy. He literally said, "Look, I'm going to like minimize our production. I'm going to not spend any money on the brands. These brands will, at sub-premium pricing, we're still going to sell, we're still going to make money, but I'm not going to invest in them at all because I'm at the end of my life." And that's a key point because all of these brands within the Pabst portfolio suffered. They had no marketing support behind them. It was just kind of like live on the fringe. So then when he passed away and it goes to the charitable trust, obviously that strategy changes a little bit. It's all about building up valuation so that you can maximize your return on that sale that is going to happen at some point.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that's a good way to get into sort of when we talk about sort of where the company is. It's at, this sort of, dire moment, this dire inflection point. It's leaderless, it's rudderless, but the brands themselves, despite the lack of investment in it that Kamenovitz, sort of had decided to do, as he's going to maybe land the plane, or like let it slowly sort of drift into the ocean, whatever the metaphor is there. The brands, even despite that, like you're talking about brands that had an enormous amount of, existing established equity, right? Like, so PBR, of course, is the one we're here to talk about today, but this was a massive portfolio of, even at the time, I mean, now we think of them as retro, but I mean, 20 years ago, they were they were these regional brands that were beloved in the Northwest or in the lower Midwest or whatever. I mean, like Grain Belt, Rainier, Olympia, Brown Derby, whatever. I mean, you could probably rattle off more than I could, but these brands had some equity, right? Even though they weren't being invested in.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, the brands that I specifically worked on, and at one point in time during my 5 or 6 years at Pabst, I worked on all of them. But I mean, Lone Star, Pearl, Old Style, Special Export, Rainier, Lucky, Schlitz, Natty Boh, Colt 45. I mean, we used to joke that, Pabst was the Anheuser-Busch of malt liquor. So, they owned Colt 45, Schlitz malt liquor, St. Ides, so like during the malt liquor heyday, like that portfolio was on fire.
Yeah.
And then, we had several brands, Hafenreffer, Narragansett, which obviously was sold. I actually worked with Mark Hellendrung on that deal when he bought that from Pabst. But yeah, there were several brands in the portfolio that were just in mothballs.
Wow.
I actually cut a deal at one point in time, that because I was the PBR brand manager and our CEO at that time, Brian Kovalchuk, I said, hey, if we grow PBR by whatever percent, I think it was like 10% in a year, that he was going to give me the rights to Falstaff beer. And we did do that. We did grow by whatever
the St. Louis brand, old St. Louis brand.
Because I'm from St. Louis. And I was like, I want the rights to that brand. And I came through on my end of the bargain. He didn't give me the brand.
No. All right. That's no good. We'll have to put that in the Taplines Grudge Hall of Fame. Come do it. All right. So you come in 2000. The company is in disarray. The brands, though they haven't been invested in, we do still, drinkers are still resonating to some extent with these brands. They still have this iconic, sort of place in their respective communities. This is right around the time, correct me if I'm wrong, but right around, the turn of the century is when there's this sort of early phenomenon that people begin to track. If they're savvy local columnists at the newspaper, or they're, sort of promoters at the local rock club, or people who are either on the fringes or who pay attention to the fringes, start to see Pabst Blue Ribbon, for lack of a better term, like kind of where it wasn't supposed to be, we were like, what are people doing with this beer? Tell me, you coming in, Neil, what was your perception of PBR around that time? Were you seeing this stuff? Was there momentum in the air that you were aware of at that time?
Absolutely not. No, I mean, I think your memory might be a little bit clouded because like it did seem to like happen all at once.
Yeah.
But when I arrived there in 2000, I mean,
I'm before it then. It had yet to rise, really.
Yeah.
Gotcha,
I mean, really it started, I think it bottomed out in 2001. Okay. So it had 23 years of decline.
Wow.
So I want to say, in 1978 was its like peak.
Yeah, it's heyday, right? Late 70s. Yep.
Yeah. Do you want to take a guess on the barrelage in 1978 for PBR?
I want to guess somewhere around. I had looked this up, but I know it from like 75 or so. I think like 18 million ish.
Pretty close. I'm going to say it's about 23 million.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So in the neighborhood.
That's a good guess.
Yeah.
So about 23 million barrels. I used to have this chart in my decks, and I would show like, the 23 years of decline, because part of the intrigue of the story was that it had so much decline. It bottomed out. You want to take a guess at what it bottomed out as? I know that number by heart.
I'm afraid to ask. Okay, so you think it went from 23 million in 1978. Lowest it goes, I'm going to say 14 million.
Oh, no, 872,000 barrels.
Oh, my God. Under a million barrels?
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't realize it got that low at all. I thought it lost like half of its volume or so. Holy smokes, man.
Yeah, lost 90% of its volume
over
that time frame.
God. Yeah. Okay, so to some people, this is a dead brand walking. Why?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, it's your job, so that's the why. But what do? It bottoms out in 2001. Where's your head at? You're 1 year into this job.
Yeah, it's, I was working on Lone Star and PBR at that time. So yeah, it bottomed out, but there was like this glimmer of hope. And by the way, it was also like the third largest brand in the portfolio. Old Milwaukee was number one. Colt 45 was number two. Old Milwaukee was still back then probably like 2.5, 3 million barrels. It was still a pretty viable brand.
Wow. Okay.
Colt was probably around 2 million barrels. So PBR bottoms out at 872, but it's the namesake of the company. So there's a little bit of pride around
You got to defend it.
Yep. And it was national. So, aside from Colt and Old Milwaukee, this was the other national brand. Everything else is kind of regional. But then there's this glimmer of hope. And it's in Portland, Oregon. And like all of a sudden, the numbers in Portland, Oregon are like through the roof. The rest of the country is like down 20%, but Portland, Oregon is up like 90%.
Whoa.
And it's like, what's going on in Portland, Oregon?
So you got on a plane, I assume. You got to get out there and see what's going on.
I did. Yeah. My boss sent me out there and he was like, you're the young, we heard, that, hey, it's these young adult consumers that are picking up PBR. The word hipster didn't even exist back then.
That's what I was going to ask. Was that even a thing just yet? No, that milieu had yet to really hit. Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah. So, I was young back then and, they said, well, Neil, you're young, go figure this out. I dug into this story and, I've actually pieced this story together more so even after I left the company. So here's number one thing that happened. There was like our sales rep out in Oregon, when PBR started to really catch on, he did the right thing, which was he gave every bar that brought PBR in, he gave them that classic Pabst neon. Mm-hmm. All right. And he got like prime locations for it. But the funny thing is that he overspent his budget by like 5 times because he like made some sort of mathematical error. But it was the best investment that the company ever made.
Yeah.
Was him blowing his budget on neons. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it literally started at a place in Southeast Portland called the Lutz Tavern.
Okay.
And the Lutz Tavern was near Reed College, which is a liberal arts college.
Sure, small little school. Yeah.
Full of hipsters, by the way. And the Lutz Tavern was the dive bar that was like, less than a mile from campus. And this is the really interesting thing. This is what I was able to piece together after I left. So the Lutz Tavern for many years had carried Blitz beer for $1 a can. All
Blitz
right?
Weinhardt.
Blitz Weinhardt.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Blitz Weinhardt. So, but it was Blitz beer, not Henry Weinhardt. Blitz beer. They sold $1 cans of Blitz beer for forever. When Pabst and Miller didn't join up, but when they completed the agreement for Miller to start contract brewing for Pabst.
Right.
Pabst had to pay them a certain amount of money. I don't know how much. They had to pay them a certain amount of money just to kind of get up and running. It wasn't just like, hey, start brewing our beer. We'll pay you when we ship it. It was like there was a fee to that. Pabst had trouble pulling together whatever that fee was. So Pabst gave Miller Brewing Company some brands. They gave them Mickey's. They gave them the Blitz Weinhardt portfolio. And there was one other one that I'm not recalling right now. So when Miller received the Blitz Weinhardt portfolio, they were like, what are we going to do with these brands? Sure, we'll do something with Henry Weinhardt's, but we're going to kill Blitz beer. That has no purpose in our portfolio. So Miller killed Blitz beer. When the Lutz Tavern could no longer get Blitz beer, what did they bring in? PBR. That became their new $1 can.
Whoa.
From Mount Hood Distributing, all right? And that is where the entire PBR trend started at the Lutz Tavern, which then it jumped down to the account down the street, a place called the Delta Cafe, which was this like kind of like hipster Southern comfort food place that started selling PBR in 40 ounces in champagne buckets because it was ironic.
Yeah.
But everything started at the Lutz Tavern because they couldn't get Blitz, and it's because Miller killed Blitz when they received it from Pabst.
There's such an that's like an incredible symmetry there. The
Yeah.
contract, the contract brewing arrangement goes through. Miller gets Blitz. Miller says, "We don't want Blitz. Forget about it." This one bar in Portland
Yeah.
had been making it. That's what the stool was standing on, was Blitz wine or Blitz sales. And
Yeah.
so we're like, well, let's just slide this other beer in there. Wow,
Yeah. What do
that's
you want?
crazy.
Yeah, yeah. Like I later met the guy who was on that route, and he was telling me about it. He was like, literally, they were just like, "Well, what can we get for $1?" And he's like, "I don't know, PBR." And they're like, "Sure, PBR. That sounds good." And that became like one of the top accounts in Portland, Oregon. And then that's where it spread. I mean, like it was all the hipsters in Southeast Portland, trendy neighborhood, and then the guy overspending on the neons. And then that's where I came in, where they were like, "Neil, you're the young guy. Like, go figure this out." So I fly up to Portland. I, ride around the market with our sales rep. He's telling me what's going on. He takes me to the Lutz Tavern. He takes me to the Delta Cafe. He takes me to a place over on the other side of the river. I can't think of the name of the account. It's closed now. It'll come to me. But it was a bike messenger bar.
Okay.
And all the bike messengers were like big PBR supporters. I start hanging out with these bike messengers. I could kind of play the part back then. I'm meeting guys that like have full like PBR tattoos on their back. They're telling me these passionate
even
stories.
Back then. Yeah. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, even back then.
Yeah.
And most of them were from the Midwest. They were transparent transplants to Portland because who wants to live in Des Moines, Iowa all their life?
Sure.
So they were from kind of where PBR was strong. And, they would tell me these passionate stories about why they supported PBR. And it was all because PBR had not been marketing to them. And it was something that they adopted and that they made into their own.
Yeah.
And then the other part of it was a tribute to their grandfather. Their dad drank mainstream light beer. And they didn't want to be like their dad. They wanted to be like their grandfather who used to throw back PBRs.
Interesting. All right. There's two things going on there. First of all, I love this idea of like you going around like the fucking mentalist of the beer industry and like doing like forensic reporting on like where patient zero was on the PBR phenomenon, like going and retracing. Also hilarious that they were like, I don't know, Neil, you're like the young dude, like go figure this out.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. It was like, that's what passed for like corporate espionage at this charitable trust, semi brewery. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So you've sort of tracked it down. You've started to engage with consumers in the market. You're out in the trade, whatever, and you hear these two things those are two major insights, right? One is it's nothing, or it has nothing. It's not being marketed, and that's why we like it. And then the other is, well, my dad drank this one thing, and the rule of thumb, listener, in the beer industry is kids don't want to drink what their dads drank. But in this case, they wanted to drink what their grandfathers drank. There was maybe like enough of a remove. It didn't feel stodgy. It felt maybe ironic, or it felt, it had come back around. So now it was retro and cool and whatever. What do you do with those insights from there, Neil? Like you're in Portland. You obviously go back to San Antonio. You've seen what is at that point, right, the only glimmer of hope for this brand, but it's a really promising one. What happens next?
Yeah, at that time it was only happening in Portland. It wasn't happening anywhere else. That same trip, when I was hanging out with the bike messengers, they approached me to sponsor a bike messenger race. And, I even went to the bike messenger race, and to this day, I couldn't tell you what a bike messenger race is, but they asked us to sponsor a bike messenger race.
Because you were like the closest thing to like the corporate guy there. You were like, I don't know, maybe Neil has we may as well ask Neil.
Yeah. Well, I'd always carry around I would carry around a bag of like swag. So I had like belt buckles and hats and stuff. And they really liked that. And I drank several beers with them, and like over the happy hour, they built up the courage to like ask me if I would sponsor this.
Okay.
And I was like, okay, like how much? And they're like, they had no idea how much money
What
to
to
ask
ask
for.
Yeah.
Yeah, because like, it's not like they are like a typical sponsorship salesperson that has like the platinum tier, the gold tier, the silver tier. They was just like, I don't know, like 2,500. And I was like, okay. And so I go back to San Antonio, and we have this, like division director sales meeting where all the division directors are gathering, and they're going through like their quarterly results, and all the numbers are in the toilet, and they're asking questions like, well, what are we going to do about this? And I raised my hand and I was like, hey, so I was in Portland, and I've got this opportunity to sponsor a bike messenger race. And they're like, what? What is that? And I'm like, no, these guys are like really into PBR. I think we should sponsor it. And I kind of got laughed out of the room because like, typical beer salespeople are like, hey, how's that going to help me move boxes?
Right.
You going up there and like giving away a bunch of beer and, you're just throwing away $2,500. Well, at that time, my boss, who was a guy named Gene Clark, who I think is one of the smartest guys in the beer business, he had worked in the beer business for a long, long time. He did this thing where he gave everyone in the marketing department like their own kind of like personal slush fund of like $10,000. And he was like, this is your money. Like, go make something happen with this. So he talks to me after the meeting. He's like, if you want to sponsor that, take it out of your fund and sponsor it. And I was like, okay. And so I did it. And I flew back up to Portland. I went to the bike messenger race, and I was kind of into videography at the time. So I took my like DV camera up there, and I like filmed this like documentary of the bike messenger race, hanging out in bars, guys tooling around parks, on their single speed bikes and everything.
Yeah.
And then I come home and I like edit it on my little iMac, and then I show it at like a company meeting with like, and I made it into like a music video. And then that was like the moment where people started to say, all right, there might be something here.
Taplines is recorded in Richmond, Virginia, and produced by yours truly and Darby Seaside, who, along with the talented Shane Farrick, composed our delightful soundtrack. Just listen to it. I also want to give a quick shout out to the entire VinePair team, and especially co-founders Adam Teeter and Josh Mellon, editor-in-chief Joanna Sherino, managing editor Tim McCurdy, and art director Danielle Grinberg, who designed our lovely Taplines logo. And of course, a big thank you to you, yes, you listener, for spending time with us week in and week out. We literally couldn't do this without you. I'm Dave Infante, and I'll catch you next time.